Welcome to the fourth episode of Killer Core Podcast.
I'm your host Richa.
And Alia.
Today we'll be discussing nature versus nurture.
And the question we'll be answering is it your genetics or upbringing? What influences a person's character?
Trigger warning, there will be discussions about bullying and assault.
Let's dive in and murder.
So the first case I'll be talking about today is a recent one that happened in South Korea. So I'm going to start the case by talking about the victim, but I'm going to use a different name because the family did not want to release the information. So I'm going to call the victim Alice. So Alice was a woman in her early 20s and she was a university student. She tutored people and helped them with their English. So it was like an online tutoring thing, but she also met up with the students. The app that Alice used, it was like a very well-known tutoring app in Korea, and they were like very particular about the safety and safeguarding. Like they made sure the tutees knew how the tutors were, like basically had all the information about the tutors on the page. And they also did lots of extensive background on the tutors because obviously they'll be teaching young kids as well. So it was quite important to make sure it was safe. Let's get into what actually happened. So one day, Alice got a request from this very adamant mom, and she wanted her to tutor her daughter. Alice was a bit hesitant at first because the house was too far away and she didn't want to travel that far. But the mom was she kept insisting and even offered to send her daughter over to Alice's. And finally, Alice, feeling bad and seeing how much they wanted her to tutor her daughter, she finally gave in. And on May 26th, 2023, the student came over to Alice's house for the tutoring lesson. So through like the peephole in the door, Alice sees this middle schooler who was wearing a school uniform, completely normal because I guess that's what she expected. So I'm going to pause there and then I'm going to talk about the person who committed the crime, so the person who's standing outside the door.
To the middle school.
Yes. So, Jung Yoo-jung, the person who's standing outside, was not a middle schooler. She was actually 23 years old, but she had a baby face.
So she could pull it off quite well.
Yeah, exactly. And she got her middle school uniform from a thrift store nearby, and Alice obviously did not know that Jung Yoo-jung was hiding a knife underneath her uniform. Back to the crime. So Alice opens the door and lets Yoo-jung in. And Yoo-jung doesn't waste her time. She takes a look around to make sure there's no one else there and repeatedly stabs Alice in the neck. Later, when investigations are taking place, psychiatrists said that Yoo-jung had searched where to stab, so she was searching which place would be more effective. So after murdering the victim, most of the evening, Yoo-jung pretended that it was her own apartment and even tried on one of Alice's coat, which is later seen on CCTV. When she's gonna dispose of the body, basically. And CCTV footage throughout the evening showed Yoo-jung bringing cleaning supplies and a suitcase into Alice's apartment. The footage also showed her being very calm and composed, which is very disturbing because she just killed someone. Yeah. And then the rest of the evening, Jung Yoo-jung spends the time dismembering Alice's body, and she puts parts of the victim's body into the suitcase. And then she gets on a taxi. Around 3 a.m., when she's on the taxi, she asks the driver to to drop her off at a nearby wooded area. And they get there, and the taxi driver, he helped her get the suitcase off. And then she walks off into like a grassy area, and she starts scattering Alice's remains in that part. And the taxi driver, he felt very suspicious, because when Yoo-jung got off the taxi and carried the luggage, it felt like something heavy was inside. Because when you're carrying something heavy, your body just has the momentum.
Yeah.
And when she comes back from the grassy area, she's walking very freely as if there's nothing in the bag. And he found that very suspicious, and immediately he alerted the police. So Jung Yoo-jung was caught almost immediately, thanks to the taxi driver. And later, when investigations was being done, and Yu Jung was questioned as to why she did it, she basically said she wanted to feel how it felt to kill. Which is, yeah,
It's quite psychopathic.
quite disturbing, yes. Thinking about Jung Yoo-jung's childhood, Yoo-jung was born in 1991 and she was sent to live with her grandfather because her parents were too busy working.
Okay. So was she sort of neglected in that sense, do you think?
Yes, I would, because our parents are like the first people we see.
Yeah.
Sort of.
So your primary caregiver, so you have like strongest relationship with them.
Yes, but the thing is, there was nothing wrong with the way her grandfather brought her up as well. Because I do feel like there must have been something going on with her parents, because in most of the legal documents, her grandfather was listed as the sole guardian instead of the parents. So there must be something there, but it's not too clear. And it's also not very sure if there was something too traumatic.
So she still had a strong parental figure in her life.
Yeah, she did. Going back to Yoo-jung's childhood, I think we're still talking about it. But yeah, she was also often described as being invisible growing up. She was a very quiet kid and basically just ignored everyone and everything in her life. She almost never left her house, so she was a bit of a loner in that sense. And her former classmates also stated that she was never bullied.
Okay.
Like in most cases, you hear the person being bullied, which messes up.
So there's no like big nurture effect, you could call it. Like there's nothing in her upbringing that really stands out.
Yeah, exactly. According to a teen psychologist, Yoo-jung was said to have very strange behavior for an adolescent, because it's usually a time where you're most curious and basically rebel and spend time with friends, sort of.
Yeah. Living that social life,
Yeah, exactly. Her classmates also said that she didn't have very strong emotions like hatred or anger to anyone. She was basically a very neutral person.
Okay, so she wasn't very expressionate and she didn't really show love or hate.
No, didn't talk to anyone, didn't interact, just herself.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Once she graduated, because she didn't have the need to interact or be in contact with anyone. She just stayed in her room.
Yeah.
And when her grandfather would ask why she is always in her room, she would say that she was studying for an entrance exam. And he would always be very proud of her for being, very dedicated, because most of the time young people just want to go out clubbing, hanging out with friends. So having someone so dedicated to getting ready for the future, he felt proud for her.
So there was never really any worry that she was doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
Or there was anything wrong with her.
Yeah. So like you said, until now there's nothing wrong with her, with the nurture part.
Yeah.
Because she has a loving, maybe not parents, but still she has a loving figure in her life. She wasn't bullied. So another interesting fact about Yoo-jung is she was obsessed with watching true crime documentaries, which I think is quite interesting because I would say we are pretty interested in true crime.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What made you interested in true crime?
Just criminals themselves. They're just so fascinating. How they deviate from the majority of people. They go against the law and they think it's okay to kill people, whereas most people, a sane person wouldn't think, yeah, I'm gonna go kill my neighbor because didn't stick the bins out or something like that.
Yeah.
But they're just so fascinating because they're so different from us. And to hear the different methods they come up with, it's so complex,
Not what I expected, but you're sort of interested in to see why they behave the way they do.
Yeah.
Okay, but you've never thought about, I wonder how it feels.
No, of course not.
Okay, good to know.
Otherwise you'd be talking about me right now.
Okay, good to know. Because, so basically Yoo-jung was also fascinated by how it works. But every time she would watch these, she would always ask the question, I wonder how they felt.
Okay. How the criminal felt?
How the criminal felt committing the crime they did. Which crosses the line onto unhealthy obsession.
Yeah, definitely.
During the questioning, Yoo-jung was very calm, same as when she literally just committed the crime. And when asked about it, she said the dismembered remains were of her babies. So the excuse she made was, she felt pregnant, she wasn't ready to be a mom, so she decided to get rid of the baby. But very obviously, they did the test and those were not
big.
Those were not baby's body parts. So the police started going through her phone and they searched through her search history. Some of the things she searched up included how to hide a corpse and basically lots of true crime documentaries, which I feel like is sort of our such histories.
Yeah, so it's not something that you really think someone commit a crime based on.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously, how to hide a corpse.
that's a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
I mean, people can be curious, I guess. but
But surely she would know that that's hard evidence used against her. Because a lot of
Yeah.
criminals, they type up everything on Google.
Yeah.
Do they not think about it? Like,
yeah, it makes you wonder. I mean, obviously they're not thinking when they murder someone, so
that's true.
obviously.
But it's quite obvious this was a premeditated murder. Like,
Oh, yeah,
she planned it
definitely.
out. She'd even got the high school uniform.
Exactly.
So you'd think she'd think about something like this.
Yeah, because the only reason she went onto that tutoring app is to have a victim to
Yeah.
murder.
So it's a long-term plan.
Yeah, and digital forensics. They also said that Yu Jung's phone was strangely empty, because like for someone her age, there were not many calls or like not many texts, not very active social media status, which is okay.
Mm-hmm.
But like even just calling someone or like the contacts on her phone, it was not normal for a human being.
Has she deleted them, or was that just her?
And it was just her. Like, it was just
Oh.
completely empty. She was just completely
She's very isolated.
isolated from the society. Forensic psychologist stated that, and I quote, "I think that we can say that Jung wanted to have what the tutor had, such as her social status and academic background, and which is why she chose the victim."
So she was sort of jealous and had envy
Yeah,
of the tutor.
because the tutor was like a university student,
Mm-hmm.
knew English very well, like a proper,
And she had like a social life, which
yeah,
was it Jung clearly didn't have.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there was a jealousy motive, but I don't think like her killing is a jealousy motive, but like choosing the victim would have
Mhm.
been a jealousy motive. And as of right now, her motive is stated as killing, to see how it felt. The police searched through her documents and called her guardian, her grandfather, to the police station, and he was very devastated. He begged her to like say the truth and confess, and she finally did. We don't know if it was because she felt sorry or just because it was too far past the point. I don't know. I just feel like she isn't the person to like feel sorry.
I mean, if she's watched a lot of true crime documentaries, she probably knows what happens when you confess anyways. So
Mhm.
maybe she'd just given up at that point. Maybe she didn't care enough.
Yeah, and her grandfather also later reported in like an interview that he never expected this to happen. Like there were no signs or anything.
Perhaps, do you think she could have been two-faced in a way? Like she presented a different persona to her grandfather.
Could have been, because yeah, she did lie saying, "Oh, I'm studying for an entrance exam," and she's just stuck in her room, maybe watching true crime documentaries day after day.
And researching, who knows what.
Yeah.
But would you say that her not having a really social life, except from her grandfather and his support, not having like friends, using social media, just not having that network, impacted her? Would you say that's a key part of the nurture?
Definitely. Like I understand introversion, like you want your alone time, but to some point it can go too far because you need people to keep you sane.
yeah.
You can't
I think you need people to keep you
healthy. Yeah.
Like, I think socializing, obviously you don't have to socialize a lot, but just talking to people on a regular basis, it keeps you mentally healthy. And if she didn't have that, then
Yeah, you just spiral with your own thoughts if you have no one to talk to, and that can take you into some very dark parts. So yeah, I would definitely say her reclusion sort of played into it. The thing is, there's no reason as to why she was so reclusive. Like she had a loving grandfather, like she had good education, she wasn't bullied in school.
Maybe, obviously she had a grandfather, but maybe the understanding that her parents were the one that took care of her. Maybe that actually affected her more than other people thought it would.
Yeah.
And maybe she made up this image in her head that her parents didn't want her, or she wasn't good enough for her parents, or perhaps something along those lines, which may have been why she isolated herself. That could definitely have a...
Could be, yeah. So in conclusion, I wouldn't say there were many signs, like very obvious signs that she would commit such a thing. And I feel like that's more scarier because her motive is basically she wanted to see how it felt. It's not like a passionate crime.
So she was in complete control of her actions.
Yeah.
It can't be blamed like she had a mental health issue or some other aspect. She knew what she was doing and she
Yeah.
had a clear motive about it.
She actually did a psychopathy test, which is tested out of 40, and she scored 28 on her second evaluation, which is quite high. There were a few serial killers who were at that level.
Mm-hmm.
You know John Wayne Gacy?
No,
He's the clown serial killer, and I think he scored 27, so which is one below her.
And
so
he was a serial killer.
He was a serial killer, yeah, and he killed like 13 people. So I would say she sort of had potential to be a serial killer if she hadn't been caught so early on.
Definitely, yeah. So there was definitely, I mean, she wasn't normal, to say the least.
Yeah.
And there is evidence to prove that with the test, and just with how she explained why she committed the crime. You know, I wanted to know how it felt, and she didn't really show. Did she show any empathy or any guilt? Or
no, nothing.
She just confessed, but there was no like breakdown
remorse or anything. Yes. So yeah, that begs the question: if people are born evil or not.
made evil. I think in her case she was.
It's hard to tell.
It's hard to
you
tell.
don't know. But yeah, let's see what you have to say about your crime.
The case I'll be talking about is the case of 4 university students. They were all studying criminology at a university in Idaho, Moscow. Their names were Madison, Zana, Ethan, and Kylie. So Ethan and Zana were a couple, but they were all really good friends, and Madison and Kylie had been friends since childhood. And they all lived in a house which was nearby to the university. And on October the 13th, 2022, after a night out, they came home, and before they were about to go to sleep, Dylan heard Kylie saying that someone was there. And 7 minutes later, allegedly, the neighbor's dog started barking.
Yeah.
So obviously, someone had intruded into the house. And Kylie saw a man walking towards her, but before she could do anything, he killed her. And we don't really know the rest of how the night went and how the murders happened, but Kylie and Madison were found dead together in bed. And on the ground floor, Ethan and Zana had also been stabbed to death in their own beds as well.
Okay, so they were all in separate rooms.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he'd obviously known the layout of the house quite clearly. He'd known where each of them were, and he knew how to target them. And the deaths were so horrific, it was said that days after the discovery, fresh blood was still dripping down from the walls and the doors.
Wow.
And that's how horrific the murders were. Like, he hadn't just tried to kill them peacefully, he'd made sure that they wouldn't wake up. And so when this was discovered, they were really confused because none of the victims had any like distinct enemies. They didn't know who did it, and they were often said to be a very friendly bunch. They didn't really make trouble with anyone.
Yeah.
So then they had to start looking at the other students at the university, and one guy that stood out to the police was Brian Koberger. Brian Koberger was a PhD student studying at the same university as them, and he was also doing criminology. So just like the students, they were studying undergraduate criminology, he was doing a PhD criminology, and he was 28 years old, and previously he had done a graduate degree in psychology, I believe. So he basically spent most of his life looking at how people think, how people function, and he was obviously very interested in criminals. And the reason they had Brian as one of their suspects was because there was actually footage of him driving around the house over a dozen times before the time of the deaths. And in the past few months, he'd been constantly stalking them. So he'd had interactions with these people.
Stalking the entire...
So he'd been stalking, I believe it was mostly Kylie or Maddie, because he had followed both Kylie and Maddie multiple times. However, even though he was like awkward around women, he was very passionate about his degree, and he'd always been very passionate about his education. For example, the previous year, in 2021, he'd actually been a graduate research assistant at a police department.
Ah, so he's really involved in the whole
Exactly.
crime.
So he kind of knows how it all works, and he knows how much the police try to get justice, but still, he committed a crime.
Yeah.
And he was also passionate about analysing crime scenes and seeing what happened based on the photos. So it makes you question, similar to your crime almost, did he commit it because he wanted to see for himself what the crime scene was was like, how the
Yeah.
criminals actually thought, because he studied a bachelor in psychology and then he done a PhD in criminology. So
yeah, I mean, those degrees sort of seem like, yeah, you're interested in to see why these things happen, but also him being an assistant in the police department, you don't join it unless you want. You do it for justice and making sure people feel safe.
exactly.
But at this point, it just sort of feels like he is doing these things just to sort of understand and learn their ways.
So he can sort of commit a crime himself.
Yeah.
Definitely. And it was said that for one of his motives, it was either because he was obsessed with the emotions and feelings of criminals, so like he wanted to commit a crime himself to feel it,
Yeah.
or that he got rejected from one of the girls, and so this was sort of his little revenge plan, which had ended in their horrific death.
Yeah, yours is interesting because it could be nature or nurture, but also a mix of both. Because yeah, he has been bullied, which you could say is nurture, but like his interest. Yeah, people get bullied, but people don't automatically go murder.
Exactly.
Like his interest in this, like
he just went to a completely different extreme.
yeah.
So it makes you really question like what was going on in his head. And an expert did review his behaviour when he ended up in court, and he was very quiet. That was something that people would point out about him. He was very quiet, but you could have a conversation with him, and when you talked about his degree, he would speak loads because he was so passionate about it. But she didn't say that his quietness was a sign of like any disorder or anything. So he didn't actually have like a disorder.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but regardless of that, he still committed this crime. After he committed the crime, he obviously thought the police went on to him, so he just went to go visit his parents. And he was driving with his dad, and the police actually pulled him over. But at this point, that police officer didn't know that he was a suspect, and they were just pulled over for, I believe it was speeding of some sort.
Yeah.
But in the video, he seemed to be very calm, not worried, even though the police just pulled him over. Like, surely he must be, all these thoughts must be going through his head, like, oh, they know what I've done, that's why they pulled me over.
Yeah.
But in the video, he's just very calm, composed, relaxed. You wouldn't think that he's just killed 4 students.
Yeah, it's crazy to think, like, even with microcrime, she seemed very calm and collected. It sort of makes you think, like, yeah, it seems very premeditated in sort of sense, like, they know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
Like, maybe they know how it feels, so they sort of know
Do
how
you
to
think,
compose.
like, she watched true crime documentaries and he studied criminology, do you think learning so much sort of can desensitize a human in that way, that when they commit a crime themselves, it's sort of...
I don't know, when someone says they like true crime, I don't really think much. Because I
Yeah.
like true crime, and I think it's pretty fascinating.
But you wouldn't go kill someone.
Yeah, I mean,
over
you
it.
assume they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, yeah, it's interesting to see why these things happen, what was going through their mind, but you don't really know what someone is thinking listening to these.
Yeah, and even with like fMRIs or EEGs, all these different brain scans, you can't read people's thoughts. Like on the brain scan, it won't pop up thinking, I'm gonna kill someone, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we as humans can never really know what someone's thinking. And so Brian continued on with his everyday life thinking he'd gotten away with it. But the police were slowly tracking him down. So they'd actually found out where his parents lived, and in the trash can they'd found his DNA. So I don't know if he'd taken out a bin bag and
Okay.
he touched it with his fingerprints. So they just got some of his DNA from there. And the importance of this DNA is that at the crime scene itself, they found DNA of a male suspect. So when they got the DNA from the trash can and they had the DNA from the crime scene, they linked it up and it was the same guy. It was Brian. So right there, they've got clear evidence that this guy, maybe he hasn't killed them, but he's at the crime scene.
Yeah.
And then I think when they searched him, they found 70 items of clothes and a gun, which were all evidence of him committing the crime.
So they searched him at his house and they
Yeah.
Okay.
So they had more than enough evidence to convict him. So they went to arrest him, and when they did, his parents didn't believe it. His parents were convinced that he hadn't done anything and that he wasn't guilty. And I think for his parents, it was really hard for them to accept this because they didn't see Brian as like an evil person. So they had to accept that their son was a monster. So I think that really shows that he had a good upbringing. His parents treated him well. His parents brought up a good kid. But still, you know, he came out like this, he still killed 4 students who had like their whole lives ahead of them.
Again, this sort of relates to the 2 crimes. Like, they might seem completely different to the family. It shows that how easily people can fake a whole other life.
Mm-hmm.
And because again, you said like you can't know someone's thoughts. It's deep inside.
Exactly.
Outside they might be like a completely normal person, but deep inside
Mm-hmm.
there could be some really dark thoughts in there.
Yeah, and I guess his parents just never thought about it. I mean, which parent really thinks their kid's going to grow up to be a criminal and go kill people? No one thinks like that.
Yeah.
So for them, it was a huge shock. So he was arrested on December 30th, 2022 for the 4 murders of the criminology students. And there's this video of him when he's in court, and when he greets his lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
he actually smiles at her. So he's in court, he's going to find out if he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison or not,
Uh-huh.
and he can still manage to smile. And when his charge was actually, read aloud to him, he remained calm.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at his cheekbone during the court, you can actually see his pulse beating. And that
Ah.
shows his high emotional stress.
Mhm.
So even though he presented himself as calm and relaxed, inside he was experiencing a lot of stress, so much that his pulse was quite obviously beating through his cheek.
Mm-hmm.
And his murder motives is still a mystery. He hasn't directly said, I killed them because of blah, blah, blah. Nobody knows for certain why he's done it.
Okay.
But a lot of people have like conspiracy theories, and it's mainly based around him being passionate about criminology, being passionate about criminals. And that's why he committed it, because he wanted to feel it for himself, or he wanted to analyze the crime scene himself.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only like rumors.
Yeah.
There's no factual knowledge on why he committed it.
Okay. It's sort of interesting because you would think, yeah, it seems more like nature because there's nothing really influencing them.
Mm-hmm.
But like crime and all these things, they're pretty much nurture. Because growing up, you don't know there's crime in this world.
Yeah.
But as they grow up, they learn, oh, there's crime.
Mm-hmm.
This looks interesting. This is not normal.
Exactly.
I want to experience it.
So definitely, even his bullying, you could say to an extent, it may have influenced it. But it doesn't seem like he was physically beaten up, or it wasn't that extreme. Of course, bullying is wrong either way.
Yeah.
But I don't think the bullying can completely explain why he killed him. So I think definitely, like you were saying, him learning criminology, him doing a bachelor in psychology, and even working at the police station, all this knowledge definitely, I don't know, helped him commit the crime or gave him extra knowledge.
Yeah.
So the next crime I'm going to talk about brings about the question if the killer did it because of nature or nurture. So on February 2nd, 2008, 4 15-year-old boys named Nick, Ryan, Taylor and Alex were dropped off at Nick's house where they were going to have a sleepover. They had recently spent the night at Ryan's, so now they were coming to Nick's. But when they arrived at the house, the door was open, and when they went in, they found Nick's dad dead on the couch, and he'd been shot.
In the basement.
No, this was in the living room. So
Oh.
I think he'd fallen asleep watching TV, and then the murderer had come and shot him.
Mm-hmm.
So he went upstairs and he went into his parents' bedroom where he found his mum shot dead. And then he went into his brother's bedroom where he found Gregory, who was 13, and Benjamin, who was 11, were both found shot dead in their beds, just like their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately Taylor, one of the boys, rushed out to get Mr. Pat, who was the father who had dropped them off at Nick's house, to come into the house. And when he discovered Nick's father's dead, he called 911 and ushered the boys out the house.
Yeah.
But the boys thought it had been a burglary gone wrong, so they ran around the side of the house to check if there was like a break-in on the other side. And that's where they saw that on the pool table there was a Wii and an Xbox piled on top of each other. You know those game controllers?
Oh, game
Yeah.
controls.
Should I have said that first? A Wii, a game
Come
controller.
on, drop a Wii.
Stop you
I was gonna question it. What?
They
It was
found
like a bird thingy.
No, they found game consoles, a Wii, and an Xbox piled on top of each other. So once the police are called, they bring all 4 boys into interrogation at the police station, right? And they're all placed in their separate rooms, so like they can't be influenced by one another.
Mm-hmm.
And so Taylor, Ryan and Alex, they all tell stories which pretty much align with each other, whereas Nick tells a story which is a bit different, and this is how he becomes the murder suspect in the police's eyes. So I'll tell you the story that Taylor, Ryan, and Alex said on the past 29 hours before they discovered Nick's family dead.
Yeah.
So the story is, after school, they all went to Ryan's house. Whilst they were at Ryan's house, you know, they played outside for a bit, they watched some movies before falling asleep. And they fell asleep around 12:30. But this is also the time that Nick left the house. But he didn't tell anyone why he was leaving. He just said he was going to go leave to go get his car. But that was it.
Okay.
So the boys didn't have any suspicions about it.
Alone at night.
Alone at night.
Okay.
But I don't think this was like abnormal for Nick. You know, he went drinking out often, and I think he'd used the car before, so it wasn't like, oh, he's gonna go and take his car, sort of like we need to be worried about 14?
It.
He's 15.
15. Okay.
Yeah, I mean his parents weren't happy about it, so they
yeah.
obviously didn't allow him to do it, but he still did it. But Nick only lived half a mile away from Ryan's house in Springdale, which is like 20 to 30 minutes away. But he was gone for 3 hours. So if he was going to go get the car and come back immediately, it shouldn't have taken him 3 hours.
Yeah,
so
and there's no traffic at 12 p.m.
Exactly.
12 a.m.
So the timeline is already a bit off.
Yeah.
So they're all going to sleep. Ryan's gone to his own bedroom, and then Taylor's gone to sleep in Ryan's brother's bedroom because he wasn't home that day. And then Alex is just sleeping in the basement. And then eventually Taylor gets kicked out from his brother's room because Ryan's parents also had friends over, so they needed to sleep in that room. So he moved to sleep with Alex. And then around, I think it was 5 o'clock, they wake up and they realise that Nick's still not home. So he's been out for like ages. So then they call Nick, and Nick says, oh, I got to my house, but the lights were on, so I couldn't take the car. You know, I didn't have the car keys, I didn't have the house keys. My parents would have known, but I fell asleep in the car. So he didn't have the car keys, but he fell asleep in the car somehow. This is the story he's telling his friends, right? On top of the car? I don't know where he fell asleep, right? But, you know, the story's not adding up. So then he comes back to Ryan's house, and at 9 a.m. in the morning, his parents were meant to come and pick him up to come clean his house before his friends arrived, and they had to sleep over there, but they never came. So he just called up his parents, left a few messages, even though he could have just walked to his house again, because it was so nearby. We didn't think to do that. So instead they all went to the mall, and then after they went to the mall, they arrived at Nick's house, where they found his family dead. So already there are a few parts which aren't adding up. So then Nick tells a slightly different story. So, you know, they all went to Ryan's house, they played outside, but he left the house at 1:30, so he said he left an hour later than his friend said, which makes his timeline like he spent less time at the house, but also making sure it doesn't coincide with the murders. And so what he said is, he said that when he got to the house, all the lights were on, and he didn't have the house or car keys. But when they went to the mall with his friends, he actually pulled out the car keys from his pocket. So he did have them.
Yeah, and the friends noticed that.
Yeah, he told his friends, and he was like, oh, I didn't realise they were there, you know. I didn't realise they were there, sort of thing. So obviously you could tell he was lying. And he'd actually called his brother up the previous night saying, leave the door open so I can come in. But he didn't tell the police that until the police called him out on it, because one of his friends had said, oh yeah, Nick called up his little brother Greg and said, you know, can you leave the door open so I can come home and get the keys. But he didn't tell the police that he left it out because he knew that would incriminate him. So he says that he slept the night in his car, and then when he came back, you know, they went to the mall, so then the story sort of coincided then. But he insisted that the house had been burglarized. So, you know, that's why the game consoles, the Wii and the Xbox were on the table. That's where his mum's jewelry was out. He was absolutely sure that someone had tried to burgle the house.
But was there anything missing from the house? Or
There was nothing missing. Like, the jewelry was all spread out, so someone had tried to stage it. But nothing had actually been stolen. And he actually tried to pin it on his neighbour Bobby. So Bobby had been in trouble with the police before. I think it was to do with drugs or some sort. So he told the police, he goes, you know, maybe it's Bobby, you know, he's been in trouble with the police before, could happen again.
So he's just naming people.
He's just naming people. He's trying to make it seem that, like, I didn't do it, how could I possibly do it, you know, I was at Ryan's house, sort of thing. But the police officers could see right through it. The 2 police officers in charge of this case had been homicide detectives for like 20 years. So they knew what a burglary was, they knew what a homicide looked like, and they could tell he was lying. So whilst in the interrogation room, before they had even started interrogating Nick, he'd actually fallen asleep whilst waiting for the detectives. And it can be seen as odd because, like, he's just seen his whole family dead,
Yeah.
and yet he's sleeping so peacefully. But then again, he may be experiencing emotions differently. He may not express them so outwardly.
Yeah.
But the detectives did find it a bit suspicious. But at this point, they've narrowed Nick down to the murder suspect. They're not looking at anyone else. You know, all his other friends have been sent home because it's quite clear they have no knowledge that he was going to do this. He was just going to go get his car. That was what they thought. So they used a few techniques to try get Nick's confession, because when they say to him, "We know you've done it," he just says, "I didn't do it. Why would I do it? I didn't do it." And when you watch the interrogation video, this goes on for a long time. Just the detective saying, "We know you did it, you know. Every day we sit in this room with killers and they fit the same mold as you." But he just goes, "You know, what mold are you talking about? Like, I didn't do it.
Completely
It's not me."
clueless.
Yeah. And he kept reinstating that, "I love my family. Why would I do it?" And then they sort of go, "Well, a lot of killers love their parents, but they kill their parents. They love their wife, but they kill their wife, you know?" So this obviously wasn't working. So then they show him a family photo and say, you know, "Think about the good times," trying to appeal to him more emotionally, but this didn't work. They even said, "You don't want to be known as a cold-blooded killer," but it still wasn't evoking any emotion. And the whole time you watch him, his face is blank.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no emotion. He doesn't look scared. He's not tearing up. He doesn't look angry. He just seems very calm.
Were there any other signs, like even if his face might not show it, like, I don't know, shaking of the hands or?
When he was first telling his story before the police thought he was a murder suspect, he would like tap the table when he was trying to emphasize some points. But at this point, not really, no. He does break down eventually.
Okay,
but we'll
yeah.
get to that point.
Yeah.
And they even said, you know, your friends have ratted you out, sort of saying like, "We already know everything, so if you're going to lie to us, we're going to know."
Mhm.
But none of this worked. So it's worth mentioning at this point that Nick had mentioned to his friends, and his friends had told the police this, how strict his father was, that he was very emotionally abusive. Like, Nick was sort of a good student. He took AP classes, which are like the advanced classes in American high schools. He got good grades, but his dad was still very strict with him, and you know, he said that sometimes he'd get yelled at more than his brothers would, and he even nicknamed him Hitler because he thought he was that strict.
Yeah.
And he said that he'd once gotten a D on his test, right? And his dad just would never stop talking about it. Like, every time he did something well, he said, "Well, you got a D on that test."
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Asian parents. But it definitely showed that it had a lot of impact on Nick emotionally. So a motive could be seen that he was angry and annoyed at his father, and then he saw an opportunity and he just took it. So the confession eventually comes out, and this is where he shows emotion for the first time for this whole interrogation, and he starts to cry. And he basically goes that he did plan to go get his car, but when he got to the house, he saw his dad asleep on the couch, and the gun was on the workshop bench, and he just took the opportunity, you know?
So it wasn't pre-planned.
It wasn't pre-planned, but this is what he tells us. Who knows, it could have been pre-planned, but this is what he told the police. He just saw the chance and he took it, but he was standing next to his father for about half an hour with the gun, contemplating whether or not to do it.
Okay.
And eventually he pulled the trigger, and then he got scared because he thought, well, if my mom and my brothers are still alive, this can make me look like the suspect. So he only killed them because he wanted to be the only one alive that knew what happened, so no one could, you know, change the story, if that made sense.
So the main target was his dad.
The main target was his dad.
Okay.
Whilst confessing, he never showed any hatred towards his mother. I mean, he said his mother drank sometimes, but
Okay.
not like she was ever abusive to him or anything like that. And while he was confessing, he did say his dad was physically abusive to him.
Oh, okay.
So it can be seen that he was abused, and he said it's been going on since first grade, which is like year 2 here. So it seems like a long-term abuse from his father, which he just couldn't handle anymore. But obviously, even if your fathers are strict, you don't go and kill them. So it doesn't make it right that he did kill his whole family.
Yeah, I don't know. I've researched another crime. It's about, I don't remember exactly, but this has happened where the mom was really overbearing,
Yeah.
and the kid basically wanted some freedom. He felt always pressurized for his entire life, which caused him to stab his mom and dismember her. It's quite gruesome.
It also brings around the question about guns. Like, if he hadn't seen that gun on the workshop bench, would he have been able to kill his father? Because stabbing, I feel like, is a lot more personal.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas a gun, you can sort of disassociate yourself from the crime. So that also brings about the question: should they allow should they allow guns in America, because it makes it so much easier to
No,
commit a
definitely,
crime like
yeah.
that.
Because you're not anywhere close, you can just stand apart.
Exactly.
Just one press.
And I think that's what he did with his brothers. He sort of stood at a long distance and just shot them. I don't think he got up personal, like right next to them.
Yeah.
Did it. So from Nick's behaviour from the interrogation video clips, it's quite clear that there are some signs of antisocial personality disorder. So people with antisocial personality disorder, they don't like to get controlled and they don't show respect for those in authority, which could explain why Nick rebelled against his father, because already he has antisocial personality disorder. These are all like sort of conspiracy theories, I guess you could call it. Like, it's not for certain that he had it.
Okay.
But some people, when watching these interrogation footage, they believe he did have it because of the way he acts. So if he did have it, it can explain why he rebelled against his father, because he already didn't have respect for authority. So it would make him more likely to rebel against his dad.
So is this like an official symptom of having antisocial disorder?
Yeah, it is. But we're just not sure if he actually had it.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, sometimes he's laughing with the detective in the video clip when talking about, like, oh, it take my grandfather like 3 hours to come down and pick me up, which shows like he has a lack of remorse for his actions, which is also associated with antisocial personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it could be seen that he just doesn't show emotion very much, or maybe he's still not come to terms with his family passing away. But someone with antisocial personality disorder, they show a lack of emotion, a lack of remorse, and I think they can also be quite aggressive at times. And there was also one key point was that despite his family being dead, he was able to eat. Like, the detectives asked him, do you want anything? And he's like, could I have some food? Could I have a soda? Like, he still had an appetite, regardless of just seeing his dad shot dead, his mom, his family just killed. Like, he was able to cope with that. So it sort of brings about the question, did he have a mental health illness? Because there were definitely symptoms that, you know, gave the likelihood that he could have.
Yeah, wait, so just to recap, this was like an emotion-driven crime, like this wasn't pre-planned?
This wasn't pre-planned. I mean, that's what he told the police.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe the reason he isn't like feeling guilty is like he had all this, you know, pressure and everything built up inside.
Mm-hmm.
One day he saw the gun, he thought this was my chance, and like,
and just took it, yeah. I mean, he never showed like signs of hurting his family before. Like, he never showed any violence towards them or anything like that. So I think it was just built up from the abuse from his father, and he thought, well, this is a way out, you know, I can finally get rid of all this pressure, and he just did it.
So it's definitely nurture, because it was his dad that mostly drove him to commit this crime, I'd say.
Yeah, but then if he did have antisocial personality disorder, because with APD you can only be diagnosed when you're 18 years old, but he was 15, so they wouldn't be able to diagnose him anyways.
Okay.
But if he did have APD, then it can be explained why he did it, because, you know, he saw the gun and he'd already been through this abuse from his father, and he didn't show any care for authority or like the consequences afterwards, which would have made him more motivated to commit the crime as well. So I think the nature and nurture had a combined effect in this crime, but as I said, we're not certain that he had it.
Yeah. So the case I'll be talking about is the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and I want to start the crime by introducing the characters. So the first person is the victim, and I say that in quotes. So Claudine, or Dee Dee Blanchard, is famously known as the mother of Gypsy Rose, who was fatally stabbed to death in her own house. Growing up, her relatives said that she often used to steal from them. Dee Dee's stepmom stated in the documentary Mommy, Dead and Dearest, which is a documentary about this case, that Dee Dee would make sure that you'd pay if things didn't go her way. Like, if she didn't like something, she would clearly state that, oh, she didn't like it, and make sure that everyone else knows it as well.
Oh, okay.
In this documentary, they also mentioned that she allegedly tried to kill her own mom by denying her food. So mom was very medically ill, and she wasn't the best daughter, and like would try to starve her to death. Right. The negative accusations against Dee Dee doesn't stop there, and we can therefore conclude that Dee Dee wasn't the best child growing up. However, the horrible things that Dee Dee's done would go to the extreme side when she gives birth to her daughter, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, in 1991.
Did she have any mental health illnesses growing up? Like, was she ever diagnosed with like depression or anything like that?
Not according to the research I've done.
Okay. Well, you could probably assume that
Yes.
growing up something had impacted her.
Yeah, I don't know about her childhood, if there are any mental health, but as you go on, they do state about one of them.
Okay.
I will later talk about that. So, talking about Gypsy's childhood, shortly after Gypsy was born, her parents decided to separate, and Dee Dee became the main guardian in her life.
Mm-hmm.
Right from her birth, Dee Dee was convinced that Gypsy was not a healthy baby.
Okay.
She took Gypsy to the hospital months after she was born, claiming that Gypsy had sleep apnea.
Mm-hmm.
After doing multitude of tests and finding no results, Dee Dee became convinced that Gypsy had an, and I quote, unspecified chromosomal disorder. Further along the timeline, Dee Dee even claimed that Gypsy had muscular dystrophy, which is a condition where the strength and condition of your skeletal muscles grew worse over time. Due to this, Gypsy was made to use a walker to help her walk. When Gypsy was around 8 years old, she fell off her granddad's motorcycle and had a minor abrasion to her knee, so like a minor scratch.
Oh, okay.
Dee Dee was unconvinced with the treatment, like she wasn't happy with everything the doctors were doing,
Mm-hmm.
and said that Gypsy would have to use a wheelchair as to not worsen the injury on her knee, which I feel like is a bit of
It's
an
quite
extreme.
extreme, yeah.
Yeah. As time went on, Dee Dee believed that Gypsy was just getting worse and worse, and her conditions now included hearing and vision problems and having seizures. But even though the doctors were unable to find any evidence for any of these medical illnesses that Dee Dee was stating Gypsy had, Gypsy was subject to anti-seizure medication and several allergies, which is quite damaging because taking medication when you don't have a problem is.
How did she get her hands on these medications if the doctors weren't providing it?
I think she was, because being a distraught parent,
Uh-huh.
that can be very convincing for the
That's
doctors. And like medicine is not 100% accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Like as a parent, they might feel like, oh, she might know best, and
Yeah.
because that's what parents want for their kids, the best.
Mhm.
So the doctors tend to believe that. Now talking about the community support that Dee Dee got because of her ailing child. When Hurricane Katrina devastated the state of New Orleans in 2005, Dee Dee and Gypsy moved to Missouri, where there were local celebrities, so there was quite a destruction in their old house. Due to Gypsy's frail condition, she and her mom, they got unconditional support from many charities and the community. One of such support was the charity called Habitat for Humanity, where they equipped them with a small house complete with a built-in ramp and a hot tub. Some of the other things they received were free flights to see doctors, free tickets to Disney World, and even backstage passes to Miranda Lambert concerts.
Oh wow.
So people were very supportive
And they got a lot of luxuries because
of Gypsy's alleged conditions. Another thing to emphasize is that Gypsy's dad was very involved in her life, the one who divorced, and would send them child support and would often come over to see Gypsy. However, Dee Dee would often change plans and told the others that he was, and I quote, abusive, drug addict, and an alcoholic.
Oh, so she made him out to be the bad guy.
Yeah, when he clearly wasn't. As time went on, Dee Dee would shave Gypsy's hair to create the impression of her being a chemo patient.
Oh, so she would shave her hair?
Yeah.
Right.
Gypsy had surgeries done to help control her drooling, which was later revealed to have been caused by topical anesthetic that Dee Dee used to numb her gums before visiting the doctors. So Dee Dee would herself give these medication so that her gums would go numb, which would cause Gypsy to drool when she clearly doesn't have any problem. It's
so just for the doctor to see that and think there's something wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So suspicions start to rise of Gypsy's lots of medical conditions. So a pediatric neurologist began to grow suspicious about Gypsy's muscular dystrophy condition, and none of the tests that he conducted had any indications of this. And when he contacted the previous hospitals about this, he found out these tests came back negative back then too, which is definitely very suspicious. He suspects that Dee Dee might have Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is where the caregiver makes up fake symptoms or causes real ones to create the impression of the child being very ill, which is what Dee Dee did. Dee Dee also forged Gypsy's age certificates so that Gypsy was often claimed to be an age very young to what she actually was. So people never really knew what her actual age was. Every time Gypsy questioned the misinformation or said that she felt fine and didn't feel like she had all these conditions, Dee Dee would physically and mentally abuse her, including handcuffing her to her bed for weeks. So it was not just like causing all these symptoms, she was also very abusive towards Gypsy. Around the year of 2012, Gypsy made contact with a guy called Nicholas. And she would use the internet after her mom had gone to bed. And Nicholas, he had a criminal record and a history of mental illnesses, which often included DID, and he also had an autism spectrum disorder. So he definitely had mental illnesses, which was quite known. Gypsy and Nicholas, they continued their online interactions, and somehow it developed into planning the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard.
So did they get into a relationship before, or were they still just friends?
No, they sort of got into a relationship going on. So, the crime. What happened? In June 2015, after coming back from a doctor's appointment, Dee Dee had gone to sleep. At this time, Gypsy brought Nicholas into the home and allegedly handed him a weapon to kill Dee Dee. So we don't know if she actually handed the weapon or if he brought his own. But it's alleged that she handed the weapon. Then Nicholas went into the bedroom and stabbed Dee Dee 17 times, while Gypsy hid in the bathroom so she wouldn't have to hear her mother's screams. So she didn't do it herself. And she also took measures to ensure that she couldn't hear or see what was going on. Then they took cash from the house and fled to a motel where they stayed for a few days. So investigations start by... So basically, a concerning Facebook post on Dee Dee's account caused the Blanchard's friend to alert the police. The house was searched after they brought a search warrant, and they found Dee Dee's body. However, what concerned the community was they found Gypsy nowhere. Gypsy was nowhere to be found. And people had the worst suspicions because they found Gypsy's wheelchair, like all her medication, and they were worried, like, oh no, is she going to be...
And they thought she was ill as well.
Yeah. They thought, is she going to be okay? Was she able to survive? And at this time, one of Gypsy's friends mentioned to the police that Gypsy had been talking to a guy online. The police, they were quickly able to track Gypsy and Nicholas down at Nicholas's place, and they quickly surrendered and was taken into custody on murder charge. Even though the news of Gypsy being alive and well was a huge relief, the community soon started to find out that everything is not what it seemed. So the truth about what Dee Dee did to Gypsy and like Gypsy not actually being ill sort of came out. So the trial happened, and it was a very interesting one because people didn't know like who was at fault here. Like it wasn't right of Gypsy to sort of plan Dee Dee's murder, but Dee Dee wasn't the best person.
Yeah, and she'd been like emotionally and physically abused and fed all these drugs throughout her whole life.
Yeah, and due to the abuse that Gypsy suffered at Dee Dee's hand, her lawyer was able to arrange a plea deal for the charges she faced, so the court did take into consideration the abuse that she faced. In 2016, Gypsy pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison with the possibility for parole, which was a lot better sentence than what Nicholas got.
Did Nicholas get life imprisonment?
Yeah, he did. So, yes, that is the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And I think this is the crime that sort of got me into the true crime world, because it's so interesting. Because it's hard to tell who's at... I mean, it's not hard. I'd definitely say Dee Dee was at fault here.
Yeah.
Because of her actions and all the trauma she caused Gypsy is the reason that Gypsy...
And it's definitely quite messed up in the respect that, like, she wanted to help her kid in a way, but, like, when her kid sort of realised that, oh, you know, my mum was making this all up, she would then handcuff her kid up. And that's just crazy.
I'd say this is a really good case in the sense that, because I don't think Gypsy had any mental illnesses.
Yeah.
It's just the fact that how she was treated by her mom, like nurture definitely played a part in what caused her actions.
And she just wanted the abuse to end, you know. I mean, I think her mom was very overbearing as well. Like, she was never alone without her mom. That's what it seems. So...
Yeah, it can be related to the crime you just said. Like, overbearing parents can sort of... It's very interesting because, like, parents who neglect their child, it's also damaging, but at the same time, there should be a balance because this is what happens when there are overbearing parents.
It's like the two extremes, neither is healthy for a child. I don't think she should have been given the 10 years in prison, because she was quite clearly a victim to abuse, and she'd been given all these drugs for her whole life, and the whole time she was a healthy child, and no child should have to go through something like that, especially from their mother. So I understand that it was premeditated murder, but I think the circumstances she was in, I mean, I couldn't blame her for it, because it was such a horrific case.
What about Nicholas then? Like, I guess he didn't go through that extreme, but he's still sort of...
He did have mental health illness.
Okay.
But I think he should have had jail time.
Do you think Gypsy should have given the chance of rehabilitation?
I don't know if Gypsy could be rehabilitated, because I feel like she's only done it because of the abuse.
Then would putting her in prison sort of... Will she be okay being there sort of thing? Like, does she...
I don't think prison would be healthy for her at all, because her whole life she hasn't had the right emotional support. I mean, she's had the support, but it hasn't been... she was fed drugs her whole life, and she was, convinced that she was ill, and then when she tried to be more individual, then her mom sort of handcuffed her and gave her that abuse.
Yeah, so the question is, like, what would be the right punishment in this sense? Because murdering someone is still wrong.
Yeah,
and she should face the consequences for it, but, like, I don't think she, like you said, needs to be rehabilitated, because I don't think there's anything to change about her. She just wanted to escape from the abuse, but at the same time, retribution, she helped murder someone, but it's very emotional driven, sort of. I wouldn't see her turning into a serial killer.
I think she just needs a lot of help from, like, psychologists and psychiatrics to really push her through that trauma she's had. And I think that itself could be, it could be seen as a punishment, because it's quite traumatic for her, I would say, and having to dig up that past and look at all those memories, it can be quite painful sometimes. So I personally think that would be an appropriate punishment for her. Maybe doing community service or something like that as a punishment, but prison would just not be the right atmosphere for her. But then again, there are so many criminals who have had they've been neglected as a child, and then people but they do deserve to go to prison because they have committed these murders.
Yeah. So yeah, that is the topic for another day. So we will be talking about rehabilitation and retribution in episode 4.
Stay tuned.
So thank you for listening to this episode, and stay safe. Trigger warning, they'll be bullying us. Okay. So Dr. Flasterstein,
who studied in Idaho.
or an adolescent. Okay.
So it's sort of made out that the burglar.
And I want to start by Wait, it's been 3 days since I've spoken to people, so. Who's got starting trouble?